the first time Cora Sullivan fired a rifle by herself. She was 22 years old, standing alone in a field outside Laramie, Wyoming, with nothing but a borrowed Winchester and the cold certainty that no one was coming to help her. That had been 5 years ago, in the autumn of 1878, when the plains still smelled like turned earth and distant smoke, and when she had been left with 60 acres of dry land, a half-broken barn, and a debt that would have crushed a lesser spirit. She had not been crushed. She had, instead, learned to press her cheek against the stock of a rifle the way other women pressed their cheeks against the soft hair of sleeping children. She had learned the rhythm of the land the way other women learned the rhythm of a husband's breathing beside them in the dark. And she had, over those 5 years, made something out of nothing so remarkable that even the oldest cattlemen in Laramie County had started tipping their hats to her when she rode into town. Cora Sullivan did not need anyone. She had spent 5 years proving it, and she had proven it well. It was the spring of 1883 when Samuel Collier rode into Laramie, and he arrived the way most trouble arrived in that part of Wyoming, quietly, without announcement, and with the kind of easy confidence that made you notice him before you ever meant to. He was 30 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from honest labor rather than vanity, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar from the road dust and travel sweat of a long ride down from Montana. He had spent 8 years working cattle drives from the Powder River Basin all the way south to the Kansas railheads, and he wore the evidence of that life in the lines at the corners of his eyes and the particular steadiness of his hands. He was not the kind of man who spoke first in a room, but he was the kind of man who, once he did speak, made the room go quiet to listen. He rode into Laramie on a bay gelding named Chester, with a bedroll behind his saddle, a letter of introduction from a rancher in Miles City, and the intention of finding work managing a cattle operation for the coming season. What he had not intended to find, and what the territory of Wyoming had not warned him about, was Cora Sullivan. He encountered her at the Laramie Land Registry office on a Tuesday morning, which was an unlikely setting for anything of significance, but the West had always been indifferent to convenience. She was standing at the front counter with a stack of documents pressed against her forearm, speaking in a measured tone to the clerk behind the counter, a heavy-set man named Delbert who had the particular brand of condescension that certain men develop naturally when confronted by capable women. "The deed is recorded under my name," she was saying, and her voice carried the kind of patience that had been earned rather than born. "It has been recorded under my name for 4 years. I do not know why you are telling me that you need a male cosigner for a property improvement loan on land that I own outright." Delbert shifted his weight behind the counter. "It is just the way the bank handles these applications, Miss Sullivan." "Mrs. Sullivan," she corrected, though there was no softness in it, only precision. "And the way the bank handles these applications is wrong, Delbert. I have documentation of my mortgage payoff. I have the deed. I have my livestock records and my crop ledger from the past 3 years. I would suggest you take those documents and present them to whoever is making this decision, because I intend to have that conversation myself if you will not." Samuel had been standing near the door, waiting to speak with the clerk about a land survey he needed, and he had watched the exchange with the quiet attention that was one of his more reliable traits. He did not step in. He did not offer to help. He watched, and he noticed the particular way she held herself, not with aggression exactly, but with a kind of rooted stillness, like a fence post that had been driven deep into good solid ground and would not be moved by ordinary pressure. Delbert eventually took her documents and disappeared into the back office, and Cora turned from the counter and found herself facing a man she did not recognize, which in a town the size of Laramie in 1883 meant he was new. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at most things, without apology. He met her gaze with the same uncomplicated steadiness. "New in town," she said. It was not a question. "Rode in yesterday," he confirmed. "Looking for work." "Looking for the right work," he said, There is a difference. She studied him for a moment with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to read people quickly, because the consequences of reading them wrong could be expensive. She noted the calluses on his hands. She noted the condition of his boots, well worn but cared for. She noted that he had not tried to intervene in her conversation with Delbert, and that he had not looked away when she turned and found him watching. "Samuel Collier," he said, and offered his hand. "Cora Sullivan," she replied and shook it. That was the beginning, though neither of them understood it as such at the time. Beginnings rarely announced themselves in the territory of Wyoming in 1883. They simply arrived, like weather, and you dealt with them as they came. She got her loan documents submitted that morning, despite Delbert's best efforts, and Samuel got his land survey information, and they walked out of the registry office into the sharp spring sunlight at the same time, and stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk in the particular way of two people who have no reason to keep talking, but find themselves not quite ready to stop. 60 acres, north of town, about 4 miles, she said, which was not the continuation he had expected, but then very little about Cora Sullivan turned out to be what he expected. "I am running about 120 head of cattle, and I have been breaking horses this winter. I'm also putting in a second alfalfa field this spring, and I need someone who knows what they are doing with a surveying line and a planting schedule." Samuel looked at her steadily. "That sounds like a job offer." "It sounds like a statement of fact," she said. "Whether it becomes a job offer depends on whether you have any idea what you are doing." 8 years on the cattle drives, he said. 3 seasons managing pasture rotation at the Hartley operation up in Powder River country. "I have broken horses, surveyed fence lines, and I can plant alfalfa without losing half the crop to poor drainage planning." She absorbed this. She pulled a small folded paper from the front pocket of her coat, a wool coat, sensible and well-made, the kind of thing a person bought to last rather than to impress, and she wrote an address on it in a clear and purposeful hand and held it out to him. "Come out tomorrow morning," she said. "Early. I will show you the land and we will see what you know." He took the paper. She walked to her horse, a solid gray mare tied at the post, and mounted with the ease of someone who had climbed into a saddle so many times that it was less an action than a reflex. She did not look back at him as she rode. Samuel Collier stood on the sidewalk in front of the Laramie Land Registry and watched her ride south down the main street, and he felt the first faint stirring of something he could not immediately name, though it was not, in that moment, anything so defined as attraction. It was closer to recognition. The feeling you sometimes got when you encountered something so fundamentally itself, so fully and completely its own thing, that it demanded your respect before it even asked for your attention. He folded the paper with her address and put it carefully in his breast pocket, and he went to find his hotel. The Sullivan land revealed itself to him the next morning the way the best land always did, gradually, with each rise of the terrain showing him something new. He rode out early, arriving just as the sun was clearing the eastern ridge, and he found Cora already in the north pasture, walking the fence line with a notebook open in her hand and her gray mare tethered to the post at the pasture gate. She was wearing work clothes, heavy canvas trousers, a flannel shirt, boots that had clearly covered a great deal of Wyoming ground, and her dark brown hair was pulled back practically under a wide-brimmed hat. She did not look up when he arrived, only held up one finger in the universal gesture of one more moment, and continued writing in her notebook. He dismounted and waited, which he did without impatience, and when she finished writing and looked up, she found that he had already turned to survey the pasture and was studying it with genuine attention. "Drainage problem along the eastern edge," he said without preamble. She walked over to stand beside him. "I have been fighting it for 3 years. Every heavy rain, I lose the bottom third of this field. You need a French drain running parallel to that tree line," he said, pointing. "About 60 feet from the fence. It would redirect the water into the low gully over there rather than pooling in the pasture." She wrote something in her notebook. She did not say anything immediately, but the fact that she wrote it down told him something important about how her mind worked. She was not dismissive. She evaluated. She decided. She spent the next 2 hours walking him over every inch of the property, and he asked the right questions about soil composition, about the cattle's grazing patterns, about her plans for the second alfalfa field, about how she managed calving season when she was working alone. That last question she answered simply, and without any of the defensiveness he might have expected, given what he had witnessed in the land office the day before. "I keep the calving cows in the small pasture near the barn," she said. "I check them every 4 hours around the clock. When I have to, I sleep in the barn." "Every 4 hours," he said. "Alone." "Alone," she confirmed. He said nothing else about it. He simply noted it, the way he noted everything about the Sullivan land and its owner, with the careful attention of a man who understood that information, properly gathered, was worth more than any number of hasty conclusions. By the time they walked back to the barn, and she showed him the horses she was currently working, 3 young geldings from last autumn's sale. Along with 2 mares, she was conditioning for trail work. He had seen enough to know 2 things. The first was that Cora Sullivan's operation was exceptional, managed with intelligence and precision that most established ranchers 3 times her size could not match. The second was that she was working at a pace and scale that was, simply put, too much for one person, and she knew it, even if she would never say so. She offered him the job standing in the middle of the barn with straw dust in the air and the horses moving softly behind them. The terms were fair: a small wage, room in the bunkhouse she had built behind the main barn, and a percentage of any improvement in the herd's weight gain by the end of the summer season. "I am not running a charity operation," she said. "If you pull your weight, you will be compensated fairly. If you do not, I will tell you clearly and once, and then I will hire someone who will." "Understood," he said. "I do not want advice about how things ought to be done differently just because you have been doing them differently somewhere else," she continued. "I want your experience applied to my land, my herd, and my plans, not the other way around." "Also understood," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You agree very easily." "I agree when what is being said is reasonable," he said. "You have said nothing unreasonable." There was a beat of silence, and something shifted very slightly in her expression, though not enough to call it anything as obvious as warmth. It was more like a kind of careful recalibration, the look of a person adjusting their initial estimate upward by a small but meaningful amount. "Good," she said. "You can move your things in today." He moved his things in that afternoon, and his life on the Sullivan Ranch began. The early weeks of that arrangement were defined, more than anything else, by the very particular dance of 2 strong-willed people learning each other's working rhythm without ever explicitly discussing it. Cora ran her operation with a disciplined dailiness that would have impressed a military commander. Every task had its time, its method, its standard of completion. She was not rigid for the sake of rigidity, but she had discovered over 5 years that on a ranch operated by one person, chaos was not a creative condition. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Structure was survival. Samuel, who had spent 8 years adapting to the rhythms of different operations under different bosses in different stretches of territory, turned out to be remarkably good at reading the unspoken rules of a new place. He learned hers within the first week. He was up before her alarm each morning, which she found obscurely irritating, because she had prided herself on being the first one out to the barn. He completed tasks without being reminded, which she appreciated. He asked questions when he was uncertain rather than proceeding on assumption and creating work, which she appreciated enormously. And when he had a different idea about how to approach something, he offered it as a suggestion, clearly and once, and accepted whatever she decided without resentment. This last quality was so unusual in her experience of working men that it took her nearly 2 weeks to stop waiting for the moment when it would stop being true. It did not stop being true. About 3 weeks into his time at the ranch, they had their first real disagreement, and it was illuminating for both of them. It concerned the fence line along the western pasture, which needed to be extended to accommodate the new alfalfa planting. Cora wanted to run the fence straight, which was the faster approach. Samuel thought they should bend it around the natural rise in the terrain about a quarter-mile out, which would add 2 days of work, but would protect the new planting from the prevailing western wind in ways that the straight line would not. They stood at the corner post in the afternoon light and argued about it with complete directness and no personal heat whatsoever, which was a new experience for both of them, though they did not say so. 2 extra days is a significant cost when I have 3 other projects running, Cora said. 2 extra days now or a compromised alfalfa yield for the entire season, Samuel said. The western wind off that ridge will flatten the new growth if it has no break. You know that country better than I do. You know what the wind does out here. She did know what the wind did. She looked at the rise in the terrain and thought about it genuinely, which was itself a thing she had not often done with other people's arguments, because other people's arguments had usually been less about the land and more about other things. "Show me exactly where you would bend it," she said. He walked her out to the rise and showed her. She looked at it from 3 angles and then stood for a long moment with her hand shading her eyes and her gaze moving across the terrain the way a person read a page they had memorized. "All right," she said. "We bend it, but we start at first light and we work through." "I did not plan on doing otherwise," he said. They built the fence line in 2.5 days, which was better than either of them had projected, and when it was done and they stood back to look at it in the evening light of a Thursday, there was a quiet satisfaction between them that needed no words. They had built something well together, and they both knew it, and that knowing sat between them like something solid and good. It was not the only time they would disagree, and it was not the only time one of them would yield to the better argument, and gradually over the spring, those moments built a kind of architecture between them, a structure of mutual respect that was, if neither of them would have named it this way, one of the most intimate things either of them had experienced. The town of Laramie had opinions about this arrangement, as small towns in 1883 were inclined to do. A young widow running a ranch alone was one thing unusual, perhaps, but explicable, especially given what people knew of Cora Sullivan's character. A young widow running a ranch with a single man on the property was something else, and the something else that the town made of it ranged from the mildly scandalous to the openly critical. Cora was aware of this. She had been aware of it when she hired him, and she had hired him anyway, because the choice before her had been between the opinion of Laramie and the practical requirements of 60 acres of Wyoming land, and she had long since decided which of those things mattered. She handled it the way she handled most things, directly, without apology, and with a calm that could occasionally be mistaken for coldness. When Mrs. Hartwell at the dry goods store made a pointed comment about the arrangements at the Sullivan place, Cora looked at her pleasantly and said, "I hire for competence, Mrs. Hartwell, the same way I buy flour. I buy what works." And when old Hector Pierce at the feed store made a rather less pleasant comment in the general company of several other men, she looked at him without any expression at all and said, "Your concern for my reputation is touching, Mr. Pierce. I trust I can rely on that same concern when it comes time to renegotiate my feed contract." Hector Pierce had not commented again. Samuel heard about some of these exchanges secondhand and directly witnessed one of them on a trip into town in late May, when a man at the post office made a remark in what the man apparently imagined was a quiet voice, and Cora heard it perfectly well and turned, and addressed the man with a composure so absolute it was almost frightening, and the man went red and found business elsewhere very quickly. He walked back to the wagon with her afterward and said nothing for a moment, and then, "Does it bother you, the talk?" She considered the question seriously, which he was coming to understand was what she did with questions that deserved it. "It used to," she said, "in the first year. When Thomas died and I was trying to keep everything together, and people would come to offer their condolences, and you could see them calculating in their heads how long before I had to sell. That bothered me. The expectation of failure bothered me considerably. She took the reins of the team from the post where she had tied them and climbed to the wagon seat. Now it is just noise. You learn to tell the difference between noise and something that requires a response. He climbed up beside her, and they started back out of town, and he thought about what she had said all the way home. Thomas Sullivan had died in the winter of 1878, 3 years into their marriage and 8 months after they had purchased the land north of Laramie. He had died of a fever that came on fast and cruel and left in the same manner, and Cora had been 22 years old and alone with 60 acres of Wyoming, and no one who believed she could manage it. She had not talked about him much, and Samuel had not pushed. But the outline of Thomas Sullivan was present in the ranch, in the same way that the frame of a building was present even after the walls went up, not always visible, but structural. What Samuel had come to understand, watching her work and listening to her talk about the land, and the cattle and the plans she had for the next season and the one after that, was that Cora's 5 years of independence had been something more than simple survival. She had not merely endured the loss of her husband and held on to the land. She had built something. Deliberately, intelligently, with real vision and a capacity for hard work that he had genuinely never encountered in quite that form before. He had worked for bosses who were hardworking. He had worked for bosses who were intelligent. He had worked for bosses who were visionary. In his experience, those qualities usually came separately, distributed across different people, and you were fortunate if your outfit had one of them in good measure. In Cora Sullivan, they came together in a single person who was also, as he was increasingly aware, possessed of a particular kind of beauty that had nothing to do with any convention of the word. It was the beauty of a person fully occupying their own life, settled into themselves with a depth and authenticity that made almost everyone else seem slightly translucent by comparison. He noticed this. He was careful about noticing it, because he understood clearly that noticing it and acting on it were two very different propositions, and that the second required a great deal more than the first. She had hired him to work her land, and she had built the terms of that arrangement with care, and the last thing he intended to do was compromise it by acting on something that was, for the moment, his own private understanding. So he worked, and she worked. And the Sullivan Ranch moved through the spring and into the early summer, with the momentum of a well-run operation finding its stride. The alfalfa field went in on schedule, and the drainage trench Samuel designed for the north pasture was dug and lined in a single long Saturday that left them both tired in a way that felt like satisfaction. The cattle herd moved through the pasture rotation he had planned, and the weight gains at the midseason check exceeded Cora's projection by a margin that made her study the numbers for a long moment and then look up at him with something she could not quite suppress. "Good," was what she said. "Thank you," was what he said, and they moved on. The horses were a different matter, and it was through the horses that things began to shift between them in ways that neither of them could have planned or predicted, because horses had a way of doing that, of cutting through the careful structures people built around themselves and getting to something more honest. She was working a young bay stallion in the round pen on a Wednesday afternoon in June when the situation became, briefly, dangerous. The horse was green and spooked easily, and something, a bird or a shadow, set him off at exactly the wrong moment, and Cora found herself at the end of a rope with a panicked horse on the other end, moving with a force that could have broken her arm or worse. Samuel was crossing the yard toward the water trough, and he saw it happen, and he moved very fast for a man who typically moved at a measured pace, vaulting the round pen fence in a motion that was more reflex than decision. And he got to her side and added his weight and his experience to the rope, and together they brought the horse down to a trembling halt in the center of the pen. It took about 15 seconds in real time, and it felt considerably longer. They stood in the center of the pen with the horse between them, both breathing harder than usual and the horse blowing and shaking but calming now, dropping his head. Cora's hat had come off. Samuel's hand was next to hers on the rope, and for a moment neither of them moved. She said evenly, "I had him." "I know," he said. "I did not need you to come in." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him then, and he looked at her, and there was a moment of something between them that was not quite an argument and not quite anything else. A moment of two people seeing each other with unusual clarity, without the pleasant professional buffer of daily work to soften the view. "Then why did you?" she asked. "Because I was afraid you might get hurt," he said. "Not because I thought you could not handle it." It was the right distinction, and she knew it was the right distinction, and knowing it did something to the careful, defended architecture she had been maintaining for 5 years, not demolished it, not even damaged it really, but shifted something inside it. The way a key shifted in a lock without actually opening the door. She handed him the lead rope. "Hold him steady while I get his front foot," she said. He held the horse. She got the foot. They finished the session together, and neither of them spoke again about what had happened, but it had happened, and it existed now between them in the same way that the fence line they had argued about and built together existed, as something made and real. Through the long afternoons of June and into July, as the Wyoming summer settled into its particular beauty, the air so clear it seemed like the distance had been painted on, the light falling golden and long across the grass, the cattle moving slowly through the rich green of the new alfalfa, a different kind of conversation began to develop between them. Not about the ranch, about other things. It started small, the way these things always started small. She asked him one evening where he had been before Montana, and he told her about the trails south Cheyenne, Abilene, the long hot months of a cattle drive where the only company was sky and dust, and other men's silences. He told it well. He had a quiet, unpretentious way of describing things that made them vivid without straining for effect. She listened, and then she told him about her own arrival in Wyoming, which he had not heard before in any detail. She had come from Illinois, she said, with Thomas, who had been optimistic about the land in the way that young men could be optimistic about things they had not yet tried. She had been optimistic, too, in a different way, less romantic about the soil, more determined about the work. They had been a good match for that reason, she said, and for others. He could see, in the careful way she spoke about Thomas, that she had loved him, not with the aching, drowning love of the novels she had never read, but with a solid, companionable love that had been genuinely good and genuinely her own. And he could see that the loss of it had been a real loss, a piece of the foundation gone, and that what she had built on the land afterward had been, in part, an answer to that loss, a proof of something she needed to prove not only to Laramie, but to herself. "Did you ever think about going back," he asked, "to Illinois after he died?" "No," she said. "There was no hesitation in it, no wistfulness. The land was mine by then. I had already decided." Decided what? She considered it for a moment, and when she answered, it was with the particular honesty of someone who had given a question genuine thought and was now reporting what they found rather than what sounded right. "That I was going to know at the end of it that I had done this myself," she said. "I did not want to spend the rest of my life wondering whether I could have, so I had to find out." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the late light on the pasture. "And have you found out?" "Mostly," she said. And something in the simplicity of that word, mostly, was more honest than anything she might have said with more confidence, and he loved her for it in that moment, without yet knowing that was what it was. July brought a cattle buyer from Cheyenne named Aldous Webb, who arrived at the Sullivan Ranch with a handsome offer, and a manner that immediately put Samuel's back up in a way that he could not quite articulate at first, and then could articulate quite clearly. Aldous Webb was about 40, well-dressed by the standards of a Wyoming cattle buyer in 1883, and he had the kind of easy, practiced confidence that worked very well on people who did not pay close attention. He was respectful enough in his initial dealings with Cora, but Samuel, watching from the background while she showed Webb the herd, began to notice the small accumulation of things. The way Webb directed most of his technical questions to Samuel rather than Cora, even when Cora was the one who answered them. The way Webb sometimes smiled at Cora's answers with a particular quality of amusement, as though he were humoring a child who had said something charming. The way, at one point during the tour of the South Pasture, Webb said, "And who manages the herd records for you?" and directed the question specifically at Samuel when Cora was standing directly beside him. Cora answered it without missing a beat. "I manage the herd records," she said. "I have managed them for 5 years. Would you like to see them?" Webb redirected smoothly, the way men who were good at this kind of thing always redirected. He made an offer on 40 head that was about 15% below what Samuel calculated the fair market rate to be, and he presented it with the breezy confidence of someone who expected it to be accepted without negotiation. Cora looked at the number for a moment and then looked up at Webb with an expression of perfect, untroubled calm. "That is not a number I can work with," she said. Webb smiled his particular smile. "Miss Sullivan, Mrs. Sullivan," she said. For the second time Samuel had witnessed this correction. It remained exact and unapologetic. "Mrs. Sullivan," Webb revised. "Market conditions this season. I am aware of market conditions this season," she said. "I am also aware of what these cattle are worth. I have their weight records, their health history, their age breakdown. I am prepared to offer 35 head at a price I think is fair and defensible by the numbers. If you want the other 5, we can discuss that separately." Webb argued politely for about 10 minutes, which was, Samuel suspected, about 9 minutes longer than he was accustomed to arguing with sellers. In the end, he agreed to 37 head at a price that was within 5% of what Samuel had calculated as fair. It was a good deal. It was a deal Cora had gotten herself through a combination of preparation, nerve, and complete indifference to Webb's practiced charm. After Webb rode away, Samuel walked with Cora back to the barn and said, "You got a good price." "I got a fair price," she said. "There is a difference." He looked at her sideways. "You knew what he was doing." "I always know what they are doing," she said, without particular bitterness. "The question is only whether you decide to care about it or whether you just get on with the deal." He thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about a lot of things she said for long times afterward. It was becoming a pattern, and it was not a pattern he was inclined to interrupt. The evening after Webb left, they sat on the porch of the main house in the warm July dusk, which was not something they had done often, shared the porch in the evening. She had offered him coffee, which was the usual post-work convention between them, but instead of retreating to the bunkhouse after it was finished the way he usually did, he had stayed, and she had not asked him to go, and they sat with the sounds of the ranch settling around them and the light going slowly out of the sky. "How did you learn to do that?" he asked after a while. "Negotiate, not just the price, the whole thing, the way you handled him." She was quiet for a moment. The question seemed to reach her differently than the practical ones usually did. It was reaching for something behind the skill rather than the skill itself, and she heard that. "Trial and error," she said. "The first buyer I dealt with in 1879, I was completely unprepared for the dynamic. I knew my cattle. I did not know that knowing my cattle would not be enough, because certain men decide before you open your mouth that you do not actually know what you know, and they deal with you on that basis." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I lost about $200 on that first deal that I should not have lost, not because my cattle were not worth more, because I did not know yet how to insist on what I knew to be true. And the second deal, better," she said. "I went in with written records, numbers in hand, made it harder for them to argue against what I was saying when what I was saying was right there in ink." She paused. "Some of them still tried." "Some of them will always try," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is simply a fact about the world. You can be angry about it or you can prepare for it. I found preparing more useful." She looked out at the darkening sky. "Though occasionally I am still angry about it." "That seems like a reasonable combination," he said. She looked at him then, and something in the way he said it, the complete lack of condescension, the simple acknowledgement of both the pragmatism and the feeling behind it, made something in her expression change in a way it did not often change. A softening that was not weakness, a kind of opening. "You are not what I expected when I hired you," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone competent who would need to be managed," she said honestly. "A hired hand I had to maintain the same way I maintained the equipment, useful and requiring regular assessment." He smiled at this. It was a real smile, not a polite one. It reached his eyes, which in his case was the only reliable measure. And instead, she was quiet for a moment, and he could see her weighing the honesty of what she was about to say against the habit of 5 years of careful self-containment. "Instead," she said slowly, "I seem to have hired someone who thinks about things the same way I do, which I did not expect." She paused. "I am not entirely sure what to do with it." It was, for Cora Sullivan, a remarkable admission, and he knew it was remarkable, which was why he treated it with care. "You do not have to do anything with it," he said quietly. "It is just true." She nodded once and turned back to the sky, and they sat together for another hour as the stars came out over Wyoming, talking sometimes and quiet other times, and both of them aware that something had been said that had not been said in words, and both of them leaving it where it was, because the country they were navigating required patience and did not reward rushing. August brought its own particular events, and the most significant of these began not on the Sullivan Ranch but in town, at the Laramie courthouse, where a man named Driscoll had filed a claim against the survey lines of the North Pasture, the very pasture where Samuel had put in the drainage trench. Driscoll was a neighbor of sorts, though at a distance, his land bordering the northwest corner of Cora's property, and he had been, in Cora's assessment, an ongoing low-grade nuisance since 1880. He ran cattle on marginal land, and he was not above letting them drift onto her grazing ground when he thought no one would notice, and he had made 2 separate informal overtures about buying her northern acreage at prices that were insulting. The survey claim was, she believed, a new strategy in the same campaign. She rode to town the morning she received the notice and went directly to the county surveyor's office, and when she came back out into the street after 45 minutes of careful document review, Samuel was waiting by the horses. She had asked him to come into town for feed supplies, and he had finished that errand and found her. "Driscoll is claiming our northern fence line is 6 feet over the county survey marker," she said. "Which, if it were true, would mean I have been encroaching on his land for 4 years. Is it true?" "No," she said flatly. "Our fence line was set from the original survey that came with the deed. But he has filed enough paperwork to require a formal resurvey, and a formal resurvey takes time and costs money, and Driscoll knows that." She looked at the courthouse across the street. "He is hoping I will settle rather than fight it, offer to sell him the northern acreage to make it go away." Samuel thought about this. "The original survey stakes," he said. "Do you still have the physical markers on the property?" She looked at him. "I have not checked them in 2 years." "Then we should check them before we do anything else," he said. "Because if they are in place and undisturbed, they are your evidence. If any of them have been moved." He did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. She understood the implication immediately. They rode back to the ranch and spent the afternoon walking the northern boundary of the property, measuring from the deed reference points, checking each survey stake. Most were exactly where they should be. 2, in the northwest corner, the corner closest to Driscoll's land, were clearly wrong. She stood at the second stake and looked at the measurements in her hands and then at the ground around the stake, and without saying anything she knelt down and looked at the soil at the base of the post, and then she sat back on her heels and said, very quietly, one word that was not the kind of word Cora Sullivan typically said. The stakes had been moved. Not far, no more than 8 feet, but enough to create the discrepancy Driscoll was claiming. And the soil disturbance at the base was recent enough that it had not yet grassed back over. "I need to document this before we do anything else," she said. He had already pulled the small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket and was sketching the position, the measurement discrepancy, and a description of the soil condition. He handed it to her without comment. She looked at what he had written. She looked at him. "When did you start carrying that?" she asked. "First week," he said simply. She took a breath, and he could see the effort it cost her to keep her composure, not because she was weak, the opposite, but because she was angry in the way that a person was angry when they understood that what had happened to them was both wrong and small, done by someone who had calculated that she would not have the resources to fight it. "We need a witness," she said. "Someone who is not me and not you," he nodded. "The county deputy. He is out this way on patrol Thursdays. Today is Wednesday." She looked at the stakes again. "We mark the current position, we document it thoroughly tonight, and we bring him out here tomorrow morning before anyone has a chance to touch it again." "Agreed," he said. They spent 2 hours that evening doing exactly that, measuring, sketching, noting, creating the most complete record they could of the tampered stakes. Samuel had a steady hand with measurements, and Cora had a clear, precise written description of everything they found. By the time the light failed, they had a record that was, in his assessment, very solid. The county deputy came out the next morning and looked at everything they had documented and at the evidence on the ground, and his expression went from neutral to interested to genuinely concerned over the course of about 20 minutes. He made his own notes. He asked good questions. He collected a soil sample from the disturbed ground. And then he rode directly to the county surveyor's office and filed his own report. The formal resurvey was completed 3 weeks later by a county surveyor who was not the one Driscoll had been hoping would be assigned, and it confirmed what Cora's deed had always said and what the original stakes had always shown. Her fence line was exactly where it should be. Driscoll's claim was dropped. He did not come out to the Sullivan Ranch afterward, and he did not make any more informal offers on the northern acreage. And when Cora encountered him at the feed store in September, he looked at the ground rather than at her, which she accepted as the appropriate response to what he had attempted. She told Samuel about the feed store encounter when she got home that evening, and he sat across the kitchen table from her and listened to it with a gravity that she appreciated and a slight tightening around his eyes that she appreciated more. "He will not try again," she said. "Men like that, they have one strategy, and when it fails they do not usually develop a new one." "No," he agreed. "They usually find an easier target." "Not my problem," she said, which was both true and somewhat final on the subject, and he smiled at the directness of it, that smile that she had started paying attention to without quite meaning to, the one that reached his eyes, the one that was real. They had dinner together that evening, which had become a more frequent occurrence over the summer, the kitchen of the main house being more comfortable than the bunkhouse for an evening meal when the work was done, and the day required some kind of gentle unwinding. She cooked simply and well beans, good bread, salt pork, and they talked about the fall plans for the cattle and the horses and the alfalfa, and then they talked about other things, and then they sat at the table with their coffee cooling and the evening going down around them, and there was a quality of ease between them that neither of them stopped to name because naming it might have disturbed it. But he looked at her across the table in the lamplight of the Sullivan kitchen, and she looked at him, and what passed between them in that look was not something that either of them could have continued pretending was only professional esteem. He said, "Cora." She looked at him and waited, and she did not look away. "I want to say something," he said. "And I want to say it plainly because I do not know another way to say things, and because you have made it clear from the beginning that you prefer plain, and because I think you deserve that." She said nothing. She kept looking at him. "I have been admiring you since the morning I watched you argue with Delbert at the land office," he said. "Not the way a man admires a woman because she is handsome, though you are, and I am not going to pretend I have not noticed. I mean the way you admire a person who is entirely and honestly themselves in a world that spends considerable effort trying to convince people, especially women, to be less than they are. He paused. Over these months, that admiration has become something different, something more. I would not say it if I thought it would make you want to send me away, but I think not saying it has become dishonest, and dishonesty does not sit well with me. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Wyoming night was full of its particular sounds: the crickets, the wind in the grass, a horse shifting in the barn. Inside, there was only the lamp and the two of them and what he had said. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that another man might have begun to hedge or qualify to walk the words back. He waited without moving. "I have been aware," she said finally carefully, "that something has been changing between us. I have been aware of it for some time." She turned her coffee cup in her hands, the same gesture he had seen before on the porch in July. "I have not known what to do with it." "I know," he said. "You told me." She looked up at him. "I did tell you." "You also said," he said very quietly, "that you were not entirely sure what to do with the fact that I thought about things the same way you did." "I remember." "I think this is related," he said. She breathed out something that was almost a laugh and was not quite, something warmer than her usual composure allowed. "I think it might be," she said. He did not reach for her hand. He did not move. He gave her the same thing he had been giving her since the first day: space to think, and the confidence that whatever she decided would be received with respect. "I built all of this by myself," she said, and there was something in her voice that was different from the way she had talked about the ranch before, something more personal and more vulnerable. "For 5 years, and I needed to build it by myself. I needed to know that I could." She looked at the table. "I'm not sure what it means to let someone in after that. I'm not sure I remember how." "I am not asking you to give any of it up," he said. "Not a single acre or a single decision. I am asking for exactly what we already have, but honestly." She looked at him for a long time. And then, slowly, she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and it was not a tentative gesture. It was the kind of thing Cora Sullivan did, which was to decide, and then do it with the full weight of herself behind it. "Honestly," she said. They sat like that for a long time, with their hands together on the Sullivan kitchen table in the lamplight, and the night outside doing what Wyoming nights did in August, filling up with stars from one horizon to the other, until the sky was almost more light than dark. And it was simple and real and honest, which was exactly what both of them needed it to be. What followed was, by the quiet conventions of the territory and the time, a courtship, though Cora would have resisted that word slightly, preferring the more factual description that two people who worked together and respected each other were now also openly honest about the fact that they loved each other, which was its own particular kind of miracle, and they both understood it as such. It changed some things and did not change others. They still worked the ranch with the same discipline and the same shared rhythm. She still made the decisions about the land and the livestock and the operations, and he still brought his experience and his ideas to those decisions as a collaborator. What changed was the texture of the time between them, the evenings that were now acknowledged and deliberate rather than simply not yet ended, the moments of laughter that came more easily, the way he touched her shoulder when he passed sometimes in the barn, and the way she let herself lean into his side on the porch in the September evenings when the nights came early and the air had the first edge of autumn in it. He was, she discovered, a person who paid attention in the most careful and consistent way. He remembered everything she told him, not just the facts of the ranch and the land, but the things that mattered to her, the things she said in the evenings at the kitchen table, the things she had lost and the things she had built. He did not make a production of this. He simply showed her, sometimes days or weeks later, that he had been listening, and what this did to her was something she had not anticipated. It made her trust him in a way that went past the professional trust they had established and into something much quieter and much deeper. She told him, one evening in October when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone entirely gold, and the cattle were moving into their winter pasture, about what the first year had really been like. After Thomas, the months of not knowing if she would lose the land, the neighbor who had come twice with offers that were charitable in the most condescending sense, offers meant to rescue her from a situation he was certain she could not manage. The banker in Laramie who had told her, gently, that perhaps she ought to consider her options. The cold mornings when she had not known where the money was coming from for feed, and had found it anyway, through careful management and one particularly good sale, and the kind of absolute refusal to fail that had no rational basis but turned out to be surprisingly durable. He listened to all of it. He did not offer reassurances she had not asked for, and he did not editorialize, and he did not tell her that she was remarkable, which she would have found embarrassing. He listened, and when she was done he said, "The fact that you are still here, having started with all of that, is one of the most impressive things I have ever encountered." "I did not do it to be impressive," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what makes it impressive." She looked at him in the October light, and something shifted in her face in a way she had stopped trying to prevent. "I love you," she said. The first time either of them had said it in those words, and she said it in the way she said most things, directly, without ornamentation, as if she were reporting something she had verified and found to be accurate. He reached across and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with the care of a man handling something irreplaceable, and he said, "I have loved you since about the 3rd week of May, when you stood in the rain checking the drainage trench even though I told you I would do it, because you needed to see for yourself that it was working." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and it was one of the most beautiful things he had ever heard. "That is a very specific moment," she said. "You are a very specific person," he said. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in November, standing in the north pasture where they had built the fence line together in the spring, with the Wyoming sky going dark blue above them and their breath showing in the cold air. He had no ring yet, that would come later, from the jeweler in Laramie, but he had thought about what he wanted to say for long enough that the words came out without any of the awkwardness that words sometimes had when they were forced. "I am not asking you to need me," he said. "You have proven very thoroughly that you do not need anyone, and I have admired every year of that proof. I am asking you to want me here, because I want to be here. On this land, in this life, with you." She looked at him for a long moment, with the cottonwood branches bare against the sky behind him and the cattle somewhere in the middle distance making their soft, low sounds, and then she said, "Yes, I want you here." They were married in December of 1883 at the Laramie courthouse, with the county clerk officiating and 2 witnesses, Me Hollies from the dry goods store, who had always been quietly in Cora's corner, and an old cattleman named Pete Reardon who had taught Samuel the Powder River pasture rotation, and who rode down from Montana specifically for the occasion, which Cora found unexpectedly touching. It was not a large wedding. It was not, by the standards of Illinois or anywhere east, a particularly ceremonial occasion. It was 2 people in their good clothes in a courthouse in Wyoming, making a decision in the direct and uncomplicated way that both of them made decisions. Cora wore a dress the color of the winter sky, a deep blue-gray wool, and she held her own bouquet of dried prairie flowers that she had collected and tied herself, because that was simply who she was, and Samuel stood beside her in a good dark coat with his hat in his hands, and when the clerk said the words and they said theirs in response, the quality of stillness in that small room was the kind that happened when something real was occurring, and everyone present understood it. He put a ring on her finger that he had picked up from the Laramie jeweler the week before, a plain gold band with a small turquoise stone, which he had chosen because the turquoise was the color of a Wyoming sky in July, and she was, in his mind, indelibly connected to that color. When she saw it, she looked at it for a long moment and then up at him, and he could see that she was not going to be able to say anything, and that was all right. They rode back to the Sullivan Ranch in the early afternoon, and they ate dinner with Pete Reardon and Me Hollies, and Pete told a very long story about a cattle drive in 1874 that got funnier as it went on. And me brought a bottle of wine from the dry goods store that turned out to be surprisingly good. And by the time the evening was done, Cora had laughed more in one afternoon than Samuel thought she typically allowed herself in a month. And he watched her laugh and felt something so full and uncomplicated that he did not try to find a word for it. Pete Reardon rode north the next morning, with a handshake for Samuel that went on for several seconds and conveyed a great deal that neither of them put into words, and me walked home across the cold fields in the early morning light. And then it was just the two of them and the ranch, the way it had been all along, only different now in every way that mattered. The winter of 1883 moving into 1884 was a cold one, as Wyoming winters tended to be, and the ranch required the constant attention that cold seasons demanded, the extra feed for the cattle, the maintenance of the water sources, the care of the horses in conditions that could be dangerous. They worked through it together with the ease of people who had been working together long enough to anticipate each other. And on the coldest evenings, they came in from the barn and ate together and sat by the fire in the main house. And sometimes they talked and sometimes they read. And the quiet of it was the best kind of quiet, the kind that is full rather than empty. In the spring of 1884, as the land began its annual conversation with the warming air, Cora told Samuel that she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before they went out to work, with her coffee in front of her and the morning light coming in through the east window, and she told him with the same directness she used for everything important, which was the only way she knew how to say things that mattered. He sat very still for a moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and he said quietly, "Cora." "November, I think," she said. "I am not entirely certain." He held her hand and looked at her, and whatever was happening behind his eyes was too large and too genuine for the composed exterior he usually maintained, and she saw it, and that seeing, his feeling laid out in front of her without any of the careful management that both of them usually applied to their emotions, was one of the most intimate things that had ever happened to her. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. "Of the birth itself, somewhat," she said. "Of the rest of it, no. I have managed more difficult things than a child." He smiled at the characteristic pragmatism of this. "You have." "We will need to arrange for someone to be here," she said. "A midwife or a doctor from town. I want the best option available." "We will find it," he said. "And the cattle will need to be—" "Cora," he said gently. She stopped. "Can we have just a moment that is not a plan?" he said. She looked at him and then she breathed out and the practical planning shell softened and she said, "Yes, all right." He came around the table and she stood up and he put his arms around her and she let him, fully, the way she had been learning to let him. And they stood in the Sullivan kitchen in the spring light with their whole future contained in that moment, warm and real and completely theirs. The summer of 1884 passed with a particular quality that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. The enormous physical fact of the expanding pregnancy, alongside the ongoing, indifferent demands of the ranch, and Cora managing both with a stubbornness that impressed him and occasionally alarmed him. She was working through June and July with full determination, and he had to choose his moments carefully when he suggested she rest, because suggestions that were not carefully framed were liable to receive the kind of look that made suggestions feel like mistakes. He had developed, over the previous year, a fairly precise sense of which moments were the right ones for which conversations with Cora Sullivan, and he applied that sense to this new situation with the same care he applied everything. The midwife they arranged was a woman named Clara Bates, who had been delivering children in the Laramie area for 15 years, and who had a reputation for competence that Cora verified through 3 separate references before she was satisfied. Clara came out to the ranch in August to meet Cora and assess the situation, and the two women spent an afternoon talking while Samuel found business in the barn, and when Clara left she told him privately, with the directness of a woman who had seen a great deal of humanity, "Your wife is going to do fine. She is the most organized, expectant mother I have ever met, and I mean that as the compliment it sounds like." "That sounds exactly right," he said. Their son was born in the first week of November, 1884, on a morning when the first snow of the season was falling on the Wyoming plains in soft, steady curtains, and the ranch was very quiet around the main house. He arrived with considerable enthusiasm after a labor that was, in Clara Bates's assessment, normal, and in Cora's assessment, the hardest physical work she had ever done, which was saying something given the previous 5 years. Samuel had spent the labor hours in the near vicinity of the main bedroom door, doing absolutely nothing useful except being physically present, which Clara had told him was in fact the most useful thing he could do, and which he had taken literally and seriously. When Clara came out and told him it was done and they were both well, he experienced a few seconds of something that was beyond his ability to process in any organized way, and then he went in. Cora was propped against the pillows with the baby in her arms, looking tired in a way he had never seen her look, not the tiredness of hard work, which always had a kind of clean satisfaction in it, but the deep, stripped-down tiredness of someone who had done something fundamental and irreversible. She also looked at the child in her arms with an expression he had never seen on her face before, not the focused, assessor's look she usually gave new things, but something unguarded and enormous, something that did not have a practical name. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she turned the baby toward him, and he looked at his son for the first time, and the world did something strange and permanent that he suspected it was going to keep doing for the rest of his life. "Hello," he said very softly to the baby. "He seems to think he is in charge," Cora said, which made him laugh, a low and quiet laugh so as not to startle the child. "He has the right parents for that," he said. She looked at him sideways, tired and luminous. "Are you saying I am bossy?" "I am saying you are capable of running things," he said carefully, "which is completely different." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which for Cora was a gesture of such complete trust that it undid him a little, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that together, while the snow fell outside and the baby made the small, exploratory sounds of someone new to the world and finding it, so far, acceptable. They named the boy James Thomas Collier James for Samuel's father, Thomas for the man who had broken this ground and loved Cora first, a tribute that seemed right and honest, and that Cora had suggested herself, which told him everything he needed to know about the kind of person she was. James Thomas Collier was, as it turned out, an enormous personality in a very small frame. He arrived into the world with opinions and expressed them with volume, and within the first weeks of his life on the Sullivan Ranch, he had already distinguished himself as someone who required more sleep than either of his parents combined, yet somehow managed to prevent them from getting any. Cora handled this with the same organizational precision she applied to everything: feeding schedules, sleep windows, the delegation of night duties on a rotation that Samuel accepted without complaint, because he had no grounds for complaint, having been the one to suggest that a child might be a good thing. He had not, in full honesty, entirely calculated what a child would cost in terms of sleep, but he suspected that pointing this out would be poorly received. The ranch in the winter of 1884 and into 1885 operated at a slightly reduced pace, adjusted for the presence of a new person who could not yet do anything useful and required constant management. But by the spring of 1885 James was large enough to be carried in a sling against Cora's chest while she walked the pastures, and by summer he was sitting in a basket in the shade of the barn while both his parents worked nearby. And by autumn he was pulling himself upright on the fence posts, with a determination that caused his father to observe that he had definitely inherited something specific from his mother. The years moved forward with the particular velocity that good years had full and fast, crowded with events that each deserved more time than they got. The Sullivan Ranch grew. A fourth pasture was cleared and fenced along the south boundary in 1885. The horse-breaking operation expanded in 1886, when Cora established a working agreement with a cavalry remount officer who needed reliable trail horses and was willing to pay for quality, which the Sullivan operation reliably provided. Samuel negotiated a winter hay contract with two neighboring outfits that made the cold months considerably more financially secure than they had been in previous years. They bought additional acreage in 1886, 20 more acres of good grazing land along the creek, from an outfit that was pulling out of Wyoming for California, and the price was fair because Cora made sure it was, and the addition brought the total Sullivan property to 80 acres, which was not a large spread by the standards of the territory, but which was managed with such precision and care that it produced at a rate that larger operations often could not match. James learned to ride at 4 years old, on a small brown pony named Biscuit, whom Samuel had selected specifically for patience of temperament, and whom James immediately began trying to race. He was, in all respects, his mother's son, focused, determined, and possessed of a confidence in his own abilities that occasionally exceeded those abilities by a small but meaningful margin. He was also his father's son in the way that mattered most, which was that he watched before he spoke and paid attention to the things that other people missed, and when he had something to say it was worth listening to. In the spring of 1887, Cora told Samuel that they were expecting a second child, and this time the announcement at the kitchen table produced a shorter silence and a faster response, because he had more information about what was coming and could act on it with greater speed, which mostly meant getting around the table to her before she had finished her coffee. "November again?" he asked, his chin resting on top of her head. "October," she said. "I think I am better at the timing this time." "Better at it," he repeated, amused. "Better at understanding what I am feeling," she said precisely, "which is different from better at the process. The process is the same as it was before, and I found it quite demanding enough the first time." He tightened his arms around her. Outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming spring was doing its annual and excellent work, the new grass coming in green and fierce, the calves in the near pasture doing the extravagant leaping that calves did in spring, and James's voice audible from the direction of the barn in what appeared to be a detailed conversation with Biscuit. Their daughter arrived in early October of 1887, in a gentler labor than James had required, but with, in Clara Bates's professional opinion, more personality immediately evident. She came into the world silent for a single long moment, and then decided she had opinions about that situation and expressed them clearly, and Cora held her and looked at her with the same unguarded enormity she had shown with James. They named her Ruth Eleanor Collier, and she was, from her first weeks, a person of very definite preferences, which she communicated to everyone around her with impressive clarity for someone who could not yet speak. James regarded her with the frank assessment of a 3-year-old encountering something new in his territory, decided within approximately 2 days that she was acceptable, and appointed himself her primary guardian with a seriousness that both of her parents found extraordinary and that Ruth, as she grew, accepted as her natural due. The ranch with 2 children was louder and more complicated and more demanding of creative scheduling and more full, and both Cora and Samuel moved through those years with the particular combination of exhaustion and joy that was simply the texture of raising children while building something real. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with strong opinions, and their arguments were direct and honest and rarely lasted long because neither of them had any interest in maintaining a position they had discovered was wrong. They were also, privately and between themselves, deeply happy in a way that had no performance in it, a happiness that was simply the daily reality of 2 people who fit each other well and who had built their life together with care and intention. Mihalis came out to the ranch on Sundays sometimes, and she and Cora would sit at the kitchen table while the children played in the yard and talk in the way that women who trust each other talked frankly, at length, about everything and nothing, and sometimes about nothing at all. Me had said to Cora once, in 1886, that she had been watching Cora Sullivan for years, and that the thing that had always struck her was that Cora had never let the land make her hard. "Some people do," Me said. "They work so hard and so long that the work gets into them, and there is nothing left except the work. You stayed yourself the whole time." Cora had thought about this for several days afterward, turning it over in her mind, and she had decided it was the truest compliment anyone had ever paid her. She told Samuel about it one evening, months later, and he nodded slowly and said, "Me has good eyes." "She does," Cora said. "It is one of the things I value about her." "Do you think it is true," he asked, "that you stayed yourself?" She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet she had always used for questions that deserved genuine thought. "I think I stayed the essential thing," she said. "The rest of me has changed considerably." She looked at him. "You changed it. The children changed it. But the essential part, yes. I think that has held." He looked at her in the lamplight, with James asleep upstairs and Ruth in her cradle in the corner making the small sounds of a baby settling into sleep, and the ranch quiet around the house, and the Wyoming night outside doing what it always did, which was to be large and full of stars and entirely itself, and he felt the sum of everything they had built together settle into him like something long awaited. "Good," he said. Which was her word, the word she used when something was right and real and needed no embellishment. She looked at him with her particular look, the direct, honest, fully present look that had not changed since the morning he had first encountered it at the Land Registry Office in the spring of 1883, and she said, "Good." The years built upon each other the way good years did, each one adding something to the structure of their life together. James Collier grew into a serious, observant boy who could read a pasture at 7 years old the way his mother read a balance sheet, quickly, accurately, and with the instinctive sense of where the problems were likely to be. Ruth was different in every way. Her brother was particular. She was exuberant and social and possessed of a personality that took up the full available space in any room she entered. And she learned to ride before she could reliably read and had opinions about horses that were, in Samuel's judgment, better informed than those of most adult men he had worked with. By 1890, the Sullivan Collier Ranch, which the Laramie County records showed under both their names, a paperwork decision that Cora had made without ceremony, and that Samuel had regarded as one of the best pieces of news he had received in any year, was one of the most consistently productive small operations in the county. Not the largest, not the most famous, but the kind of place that people in the territory knew about in the way that they knew about things that simply worked and went on working without drama or failure. The cattle herd stood at 160 head by 1890, up from the 120 when Samuel had arrived. The alfalfa fields, now 3, the original and the 2 added fields, produced consistently. The horse operation supplied trail animals to 3 different clients on annual contract, including the cavalry remount officer, whose successor had continued the arrangement because the quality was reliable, and reliability in horses was not something to dismiss. Cora was 27 when Samuel had arrived and was 34 in 1890, and the 7 years had marked her in the ways that outdoor work and motherhood and a full life in difficult country marked a person, not unkindly, but honestly. She was more beautiful to him at 34 than she had been at 27, because at 34 the years were all visible, all accounted for, and he knew what each of them had cost and what each of them had built, and there was nothing in her face that was not earned. He was 37 in 1890, and he had been on the Sullivan land, their land now, for 7 years, and there was not one morning of those 7 years that he had woken up in that place and wanted to be anywhere else. He had spent 8 years before Cora on the move, following the work, sleeping in bunkhouses and trail camps and other men's outbuildings, and he had been good at it and had not been unhappy in it. But it had not been this. This was something of a different order entirely, the specific and irreplaceable feeling of being fully home, in the place where you belonged, with the person you belonged to. On the evening of the 7th anniversary of the day, they had met at the Laramie Land Registry office, a date that Cora maintained in a way that Samuel found touching, given that she was not a person given to sentiment as a general rule, but had a very precise memory for dates that mattered. They sat on the porch after the children were in bed, with the spring night coming on and the ranch settling into its evening sounds. 7 years since you interrupted my argument with Delbert, she said. I did not interrupt your argument, he said. I stood near it politely. You watched it, she said, which in a room that size amounted to an audience of one, which is a kind of participation. A generous interpretation, he said. I am practicing, she said, and he looked at her, and she was smiling, really smiling, the unguarded, warm smile that he had loved since the first time she had produced it, and that she spent these days showing him much more freely than she used to. Me says I should practice generosity in my interpretations more often. She says I have a tendency toward the literal. Me is not wrong, he said. Me is frequently not wrong, Cora agreed. It is one of her more useful qualities. He put his arm around her and she settled into his side with the ease of long practice, and they looked out at the Wyoming evening, and the land was all around them in the spring dark, their land, the 60 original acres and the 20 added, every fence line and drainage trench and planted field a record of decisions made and work done and something built that would last. I think about it sometimes, she said after a while. What those years were before you came, the 5 years. Do you regret any of it? No, she said immediately and absolutely. Not one day, not one decision. I needed every one of those years. She was quiet for a moment. But I am glad the next years are different. The next years, he said. The ones ahead, she said. I am glad they are not the same as the ones before. He pressed his lips to her hair and she turned her face up to him, and the kiss they shared was warm and unhurried, the kiss of two people who had all the time they needed and knew it. What do you want from them? He asked. The years ahead. She thought about it, which she always did, and when she answered it was with the same honest precision she brought to everything. What we have, she said. More of it. The children grown and the ranch steady and you here. I want the whole ordinary weight of it. Ordinary weight of it, he repeated quietly like a thing worth remembering. It sounds smaller than it is, she said. It sounds exactly like what it is, he said, which is everything. She took his hand and they sat together on the porch of the house they had built a life in, and the Wyoming night went on doing what the Wyoming night always did, enormous and star-filled and entirely indifferent to the smallness of human concerns, and yet somehow containing, in its vastness, all of theirs exactly. James came to work the ranch seriously at the age of 12, in 1896, and by the time he was 15, he had a working knowledge of every acre of the property, and a developing sense of cattle management that made even old Pete Reardon, who came down from Montana to visit for the last time that year, and whose health was not what it had been, shake his head with the slow approval of an old man seeing something genuine in a young one. Ruth was 12 that year, and her primary interest remained horses, which had by then expanded from riding to actual training. She had a gift for it that was remarkable to observe, the particular quality of patience and authority that good horse trainers had, the ability to communicate with an animal in a language that was entirely without words. Cora watched her daughter work a young horse in the round pen one afternoon that summer, standing at the fence beside Samuel with her elbows resting on the top rail, and she watched the way Ruth moved, patient, purposeful, entirely present in the work, and she said quietly, "She has your patience. She has your nerve," he said. The combination is something. It is something, Cora agreed, with the specific maternal pride that she expressed the way she expressed all strong feeling, which was quietly and with precision, but entirely genuinely. Ruth went on to be one of the best horse trainers in Laramie County, which was not a title that anyone formally awarded her, but which was the natural conclusion that anyone who watched her work eventually reached. By the time she was 17, she was conditioning horses for two separate outfits on commission, under a working arrangement that Cora had helped her establish with the same care and attention to fair terms that Cora brought to every negotiation. The cavalry remount officer's third successor came out to look at a horse Ruth had trained and came away shaking his head in the good direction. James married at 22, a measured and steady young woman from a neighboring outfit named Clara, who had grown up on ranch land and understood its demands, and who appreciated James's particular brand of quiet attention in the same way that Cora had, over time, come to appreciate Samuel's. The wedding was held at the Samuel Collier ranch in the early autumn, with the cottonwoods along the creek gone gold and the Wyoming sky at its exact October best. And Hollis came, older now and moving more slowly but entirely herself, and danced at the reception with more energy than anyone half her age. Samuel danced with Cora, which they did not do often, because occasions for dancing were not abundant in the life of a working ranch in Wyoming. But when they did, it was with the easy, unconscious fit of people who knew each other in the way that only a great deal of shared time and honest living produced. She put her hand on his shoulder, and he put his hand at her waist, and they moved together in the lantern light of the barn, while James and Clara danced and Ruth talked horses with anyone who would stand still long enough to listen, and the whole evening had the quality of something complete and good. He said in her ear as they danced, 40 years old, and you are still the most interesting person I have ever met. She leaned back slightly to look at him. That is a very high standard to try to maintain. You do not try, he said. It is just what you are. She looked at him with her direct, honest look, and then she said, 44, and you are still the only person who has ever made me feel that being completely myself was not a problem to be solved. He pulled her a little closer, and she let him, and they danced through the rest of the song while Wyoming night settled around the barn and the lanterns swung gently, and everything that mattered to both of them was contained in the light of that one good evening. Ruth married at 20 in 1907, a horse breeder named Daniel Marsh, who was good with animals and respectful of Ruth's expertise, and who had the intelligence, which not all men possessed, to understand that marrying someone exceptional meant stepping back sometimes and letting that exceptionalism have the space it needed. Cora liked him for multiple reasons, and the primary one was that he looked at Ruth the same way Samuel looked at her, with the full attention of a person who was seeing something real and valued it accordingly. The ranch went on. The seasons moved through it one after another with the indifferent constancy of Wyoming weather, hard winters, brilliant summers, the particular poignancy of the spring, and the particular clarity of autumn. Cora managed it with Samuel beside her, and then increasingly alongside James, and eventually with the grandchildren weaving in and out of the working days of the place, which was how ranches survived through time, not by remaining fixed but by expanding, taking new people in, growing the circle without losing the center. James and Clara's first child was a boy, born in 1903, whom they named Samuel after his grandfather, which produced a reaction in the elder Samuel that he managed with considerably less composure than he usually brought to things. Cora watched him hold his grandson for the first time, this contained and steady man who had come to Wyoming with a bedroll and a letter of introduction and had become the most essential person in her life, and she saw the look on his face and she thought, with the full and certain knowledge of 20 years of loving him, that there was not a single thing in her life she would undo. Not the 5 years alone. Not the hard winters and the land disputes and the cattle buyers with their condescension, and the fence lines built in the rain and the mornings when everything was difficult, and the evenings when everything was worth it. Not one day of any of it, because every day had been hers and had led, with the patient and unhurried logic of real life, to exactly this. She went to stand beside him, the grandmother Samuel cradled in his arms with the same careful hands that had calved cattle and built fence lines and fixed drainage trenches, and tucked her hair back from her face in 100 ordinary moments that were each, in their own way, extraordinary. She put her hand on his arm, and he turned to look at her, and they were both in their 50s now, the early dawn years of their lives long behind them, and the look that passed between them was the look of everything shared. Every year, every season, every decision made together and apart. Every morning they had woken up on the land they had made together and gone out into the Wyoming day with the certain knowledge of who they were and what they had. "Good," she said quietly, looking at the baby and at him. "Good," he agreed, and it was. It was entirely, completely, exactly that. The Sullivan Collier Ranch stood for decades more after that, worked by James and eventually by his son Samuel, and by Ruth's children who came to help in the summers. A piece of Wyoming ground that had been turned by one young woman's refusal to fail and built into something lasting by the life she had made on it first alone, proving everything that needed to be proved, and then together. With the cowboy who had arrived one spring morning and had the particular wisdom to see what he was looking at and the patience to wait until she was ready to let him love her. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the way of all things that are made with genuine care and full attention to the truth of what they are, exactly right.